And we're going to go in a little bit different direction with the next session. We'll be talking about something that is nowhere near as technical, but is incredibly important, and it affects the use of a new technology. So we're going to be going to a panel that's called The Environment and NextGen. And so we have invited a group of people together who have some of the bumps and bruises from issues related to this area. They certainly have a lot of experience and a lot of expertise. And so I think you're really going to enjoy the conversation. So I want to thank Margaret McKeough she's the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer from the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. Margaret had participated in the development by giving us a lot of information about the experiences that she's had in the real world of managing community outreach here in the Washington, D.C. area. As the work was done, that was recognized yesterday on the community outreach. So she's well equipped to lead this panel. And with that, Margaret?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having all of us. I think this is going to be a jolting panel to start the day. We want to certainly, as has been acknowledged, not be too technical, but to really take a few moments in the next 45 minutes to talk about what I like to say is where the rubber hits the road. There's such great planning and respectful goals and objectives that the NextGen program is working hard to achieve for the airspace system in the United States. But as we all know, all good plans have their sense of great results, but also great challenges. And today, I'm confident that with my panel colleagues here to the left, we're going to explore those great benefits as well as some of the lingering challenges that we all continue to work very hard on. So let me begin by first acknowledging who's joining me here on the stage, and in just a moment I'm going to give them all an opportunity to introduce themselves more directly. You do have the bios for all the speakers, but immediately to my left is Curtis Holzclaw. Curtis is the Acting Director of Environment and Energy for the FAA. Curtis has been involved in a number of issues with local airports, as well as the NextGen program implementation on behalf of the FAA. And sitting to the left of Curtis is Takafumi Nakata. And Takafumi is bringing to the panel this morning the perspective on the experiences that Japan has had in trying to upgrade and improve the Japan airspace and address environmental issues in Japan. And I think we're going to hear some interesting parallels with the NextGen experience and that going on in Japan. To the left of Takafumi is Gary Young. And Gary is the Director of Airport Affairs and Economic Development for the city of College Park, Georgia. A very interesting position and one that's quite unique, that doesn't exist in most counties and cities across the United States. And I look forward to hearing Gary's experiences and perspectives and how his employer, the city of College Park, is handling issues, not being the direct airport operator, but yet certainly as a community having a lot of overlapping issues with its constituents on what is happening down in Atlanta with NextGen and all the new procedures going into place. And then on the far left is Nancy Young, and Nancy is the Vice President of Environmental Affairs for the Airline Trade Association, A4A, and has just been involved in a plethora of issues associated with NextGen and brings a lot of perspective to the panel as well. So with that very brief introduction, let me ask each of our panelists to just take a moment and provide some context for the audience on their experience in their role on the environmental issues and the NextGen deployment. And we'll start with you, Curtis.
Thank you, Margaret. Good morning, everyone. As Acting Director for FAA's Office of Environment and Energy, being a staff office to the administrator, We work in several different areas of environmental research, environmental policy. We are involved in developing noise and emissions regulations for the aircraft fleet and for the engines. And we have a lot of interaction with the other lines of business within FAA, be it the safety organization, airports organization, and air traffic organization, in looking at better understanding the environmental impacts of aviation and what are the potential options that we have to mitigate those impacts, be it technology improvements, which we have a aggressive technology development program that we can speak to later, whether it's operational improvements or infrastructure, and whether it might be putting in place alternative fuels, which we're actively engaged in. So as it relates to NextGen, we're looking at what are the potential environmental impacts, making sure that we assess those during the process of implementing procedures within the NextGen program, and then trying to identify better methods, procedures, and processes to make the most out of our mitigation options as we can.
Thank you. Takafumi?
Hi, thank you, Margaret. My name is Takafumi Nakada. I'm from Electronic Navigation Research Institute, being a director of surveillance communications. And let me briefly explain about what END is. END is a state-run research institute specialized in navigation systems. It was established just 50 years ago, and our main area of research are CNS-18 matters. But recently, we deal with aeronautical information management, such as SRIM, and electromagnetic interference, such as wireless aircraft intercommunication and portable electronic devices, etc. And the reason why I put myself in this panel is like this. One of the END's mission is to achieve the goal of improving capacity and enhancement of a navigation system, but also to contribute to the environmental protection. And the second reason is that prior to ENRI, I was working for Japanese Civil Aviation Bureau, which is equivalent to the FAA. And in that time, I had experience of 3 times at Environmental Protection Division, especially at noise abatement technology matters. And thirdly, it is my great pleasure to be part of this panel, and by providing Japanese experience and my research and navigation expertise to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary?
I'm Gary Young. I'm Director of Airport Affairs and Economic Development Project Manager for the City of College Park, Georgia. College Park is home to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The airport's domestic terminal, Concourse T, A, and the southern part of B are in the city limits of College Park, but it's controlled by the City of Atlanta. The airport's departure and arrival paths pass over our city. My job is to be the liaison between the City of College Park, the City of Atlanta, and the FAA on all issues related to the operations of the airport. It's my task to help our elected officials understand the perspective of the airlines. We have a great airline, Delta, which is in Atlanta, 33,000 employees stateside, and the position of the airport with its 68,000 employees, and to craft the city's response, comments to the FAA on proposed policy changes. I work with the UAS task force for the state of Georgia, and I also work with the external advisory board for the Daniel Guggenheim School of Aerospace Engineering at Georgia Tech to help those students understand the the broader impacts of the technology improvements that they are working on.
And for Nancy Young, I head up the environmental programs at Airlines for America. And what you may know about A4A is that we represent the major US airlines, and you think, okay, excellence in aviation and growing aviation. A key part of A4A's written mission is to help our members with their goals of excellence in environment. And that is a great role for me to be in, because that means we're integrating what we do on the environment with the business. And when it comes to NextGen and thinking about the future of US aviation and its excellence, we have really focused on that. And for a long time, we've been part of an international coalition, in fact, to advance emissions reductions and fuel efficiency goals, achieving carbon neutral growth from 2020, and having modernized air traffic control systems that are run on a business case basis are very critical to that, along with the many other programs that we're going to talk about today. So we're very pleased to advance NextGen, very pleased to advance the environmental side, and we're pleased to be part of the community engagement work for the PBN Blueprint Task Force, because we realize that all those things come together to achieve our common goals.
Thank you. Okay, let's get started. It occurs to me that it is the end of the school year, and there's a lot of folks that are going about assessing grades and performance in the form of grades. So I'm going to challenge our panel here this morning to let's stop and reflect on where we are. We've heard that the program itself has some pretty robust goals. So in the areas of energy use, decreased emissions, advancement of alternative fuels, advancement of new aircraft technologies, and one I didn't hear mentioned, but I know we're going to talk a lot about today, reducing the number of people who are exposed to significant noise levels from the aviation system. That's a pretty robust, challenging curriculum to master and to progress on. So let me ask each of you to, as we kind of wrap up the academic year for most schools around, if you were wrapping this up and giving an assessment, you had the latitude here to give a general grade across all areas or to focus in on a particular one. How are we doing? Let's look in the mirror and reflect on how well are we really doing with making progress in those diverse areas of energy use, decreased emissions, advancing alternative fuels, new aircraft technologies, and limiting noise. Nancy's smiling. Do you want to start us out,
Okay,
Nancy?
yes. Well, I think we...
Are we on track?
Yeah, well, we are very much on track, and you have to kind of take the long view in a way. I mean, talking about fuel efficiency, for example, US airlines improved their fuel efficiency 120% since 1978. And so what? That means we've saved 4 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. So what? That's about taking 23 million cars off the road each of those years. Our very efficient air traffic management system has been part of it, but it's well known that the inefficiencies contribute some percentage of emissions that we could avoid otherwise. So we've continued to improve fuel efficiency. There's more room. On noise, we've reduced the number of people exposed to significant levels of noise, and I know we're going to get into that term later, by 95% since the mid-70s, while more than tripling enplanements. On sustainable alternative aviation fuel, we have literally launched a new industry. Everybody's familiar with ground-based fuels, alternative fuels, but it took airlines, airports, manufacturers, and a lot of leadership from FAA, which we've really benefited from, to make that a reality. And we have United Airlines now taking alternative fuel at LAX, and almost all of our members have agreements or pre-purchase agreements for buying those fuels. So I think we have a lot of progress on that, but we're going to get to this issue. We have more to do to implement NextGen around the country, implement it around the country responsibly, and I'm sure Gary and others are going to get into issues. We've hit a few road bumps in terms of relearning lessons about exposures of communities, particularly to noise, and we are working to manage those, but we're working through that now, and I know we'll talk about the detail a bit.
Curtis, do you want to?
Sure. definitely agree with Nancy on several points there. From an FAA perspective, our environmental research program is under the NextGen umbrella, and we've made great progress over the past 7 to 8 years under our CLEAN program, the Continuous Lower Energy Noise Emissions program, that is aimed at accelerating technology development in the area of noise reduction, emissions reduction, improved fuel efficiency. We worked hand in hand with NASA on their programs, but the aim of the FAA program is to take technologies that NASA has developed with industry participation and to try to accelerate those into commercialization. So our program, the CLEAN program, is a one-to-one cost share with industry. Industry typically puts more funds into the program than into the development of the technologies than our program can. But we're already seeing some of the technologies that have been developed make their way into aircraft that are rolling off of the production line. And that means all of those benefits are starting to accrue to the communities around airports. And then on alternative fuels, which is another separate area of development per se, and Nancy referred to the airlines already taking up those fuels for use. We still have an active program to work with the International Fuel Approval Agency, ASTM, to streamline and accelerate fuel approvals so that these different feedstocks can get approved for alternative fuels and use in commercial aviation. So those are just two aspects of the work under the NextGen umbrella to touch on what Nancy was talking about. And we can get into the other areas. Of course, fuel burn reduction is going to reduce carbon dioxide, and equally important, it's going to reduce the emissions that will occur around the airport terminal, be it NOx emissions, particulate matter emissions, and of course, to the extent that NextGen contributes to reducing delays, which it has, then we're reducing hydrocarbon emissions and carbon monoxide emissions that you would have just from the aircraft sitting on the tarmac or sitting waiting for it to take off. So there's been a lot of improvements that have emanated from both industry development and what FAA is doing under our programs.
Okay, but you two are big, really easy graders here, and I'm not going to let you get away with that here. You've talked about the progress. So is it all progress, and it's a solid A across the board? Nancy, you alluded to some issues with noise, which we are going to talk about in just a minute with Gary. Overall, where do we need to make more progress? Nancy and Curtis, if you had to point out an area where you want the student to pick up the pace, where would it be?
Well, one area that, in terms of NextGen implementation, that we picked up on and learned some tough lessons, honestly, and we worked with RTCA on the PBM blueprint in relation to this, and that is community engagement and community involvement. Honestly, we have area for improvement there. We didn't do the best job that we could in getting out to communities and elected officials, and even in some cases the airport authorities, to make sure that we were properly and adequately coordinating with them on NextGen implementation at specific locations. And as a result of the PBM blueprint and some other efforts that we had underway, we've reinvigorated FAA employees and staff that are working specifically on NextGen to do a better job on community engagement, do it early on in the program so that we can get the word out on what is the procedural improvement that's being proposed, take public feedback on that, and work more cooperatively with elected officials and community representatives to make sure that they understand the benefits of NextGen and some environmental issues that they may be concerned with.
That sounds like a great segue over to Gary for perspective from the local level. And let me just ask you, as we just heard from Curtis and Nancy some of the great benefits that have been achieved. I can tell you as a local airport operator working with the local community and the FAA and our airlines at Reagan National, I never hear from the local community about the feeling of comfort on the progress that has just been spoken to by Nancy and Curtis. And as Gary probably knows, the most dominant issue, I know at least in our community, and we'll hear from yours in a moment, is the noise issue. So try to provide some commentary holistically in the context of what Nancy and Curtis have said. Why doesn't the local community engage in a more macro level on all these benefits?
So in grading the outcomes of the implementation of NextGen, I think there's been extraordinary achievements. From the economic development perspective, what you have done, the people in this room, the businesses, you have created an opportunity for people to look at the airport area and see it as an area for a wide area of development, of business. That's extraordinary. There was a time back in the 70s and 80s when, during the demolition, particularly in the city of College Park, of all of the residential communities, when there was a feeling that there wasn't very much that this airport area could be used for other than for warehousing. Today, we're looking at an economy that can be extraordinarily vibrant. Look here at the city that we are in, this hotel, everything that's grown in proximity to your airport. We'll see that same thing coming around other airports in the United States, and it's because of the good work that's been done here. Now, from the local community side, there has been an impact. The narrowing of the flight paths, increased throughput through the airport as planes can operate closer together. That creates an issue out in the communities if you are living under one of those flight paths. I'm the person who gets the calls from the local community and has to share them with the airport, and then in communication here when I'm meeting with our congressional delegation. So there's an area of opportunity there. We see in the city of College Park, there are two proposals that we have. One is for an evaluation of the current noise metric to see if there's a better way, a noise metric that can better incorporate the implications of NextGen under those narrower flight paths. And then if that can be found, then is it possible to do some additional noise mitigation, perhaps in properties that had already had them but are specifically impacted under those narrower flight paths?
And the city's taking the lead.
The city is taking the lead. So when we come to Washington and we're meeting with our delegation, this is something that we are advocating, that be part of the upcoming conversations.
And Takafumi, I want to ask you in the experience, maybe you can draw some parallels for our audience in terms of the experiences in Japan, and in particular, if you can give any advice or conversely draw on any lessons learned from the NextGen experience with Japan airspace issues.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Margaret. As I told earlier, we also have an ATM modernization program, which is called CARAT, and which was established about 6 years ago. And the baseline of the CARAT is our ICAO's global ATM operational concept and the global navigation plan, etc. And we have a target regarding the environment there. And talking about the progress so far, we can also say that we made a big progress by doing a lot of effort in terms of CO2 reduction or increase of operational efficiency, etc. But the noise is, for us, a new problem. We already encountered, but we are going to encounter another type of noise issues, especially at distant area from airport runway. Let me give you an example. We have a Haneda International Airport, which is located to just 20 kilometers away from the center of Tokyo. And we are now setting several flight passes, and all the flight passes are contained in the Bay Area, Tokyo Bay Area. And after getting height, the departing aircraft will fly over the land, and vice versa, the incoming flight will fly over the land. So as Gary mentioned, the noise level decreased significantly compared to the 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but the frequency and the concentration of noise has become more frequent and increasingly. So the people have noticed that why the aircraft converge at the same point exactly recently. According to officials 10 years ago, they will do radar vectoring and so fly wider area, not concentrate on such narrower point. So there is a kind of matter of credibility against authority, and sometimes to the local municipalities and aircraft operators, etc. So yeah, that's what's happening in Japan.
Okay, thank you. Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, if I could come back a little bit on the broader question of NextGen benefits, and I think our Japanese friend just raised some of those in his country, but I think we collectively as an industry, and I don't mean just the airlines, we may have made a mistake some years ago when we understandably were trying to do a cost-benefit analysis about why do NextGen, why should airlines invest in equipage, why should we all be transitioning to satellite-based systems and all of the datacom. And we were looking at it in terms of something you could monetize, which was the fuel burn. And a lot of times you still see it out there. NextGen is X dollars of savings in fuel. And that is just one sliver of it. And we did it for a very particular reason, and we thought everybody knows all the other benefits. But we always have to come back to that fuel relates to emissions, carbon dioxide and the other local emissions that Curtis raised. Decreased delays, that benefits everybody. It benefits the passengers, the shipping public, it benefits the businesses, the communities. The importance of NextGen to the economy, and the importance, frankly, to the United States in terms of being an excellent aviation power for, and continuing that tradition. And I don't think, and I think we really have recognized this in the last year or so, we haven't packaged that in every single communication. So when we're talking about aircraft noise and the change in noise, we can say NextGen overall improves noise exposure. That is true. But it causes a new concentrated noise problem. That's all people may think about if they're affected by noise. We have to package it so that the entire benefit of NextGen gets across. It may not make people more happy. I think as Administrator Huerta said yesterday, they're still unhappy about their noise exposure, but if they understand the broader contents, it's easier for them to at least appreciate where that fits.
And Nancy, I think that's a great point to just deter a little bit to my own personal experience here at Reagan National. We have 6 political jurisdictions that represent communities around Reagan National. So and we happen to be, as you all probably know, one of the Metroplex project NextGen has gone live in our geographic area. And so we very early on started to hear from all of those 6 communities and political jurisdictions. And to the point that Nancy states, we have been in 2 years worth of monthly meetings with community representatives of all of those jurisdictions. FAA has been fabulous in attending. American Airlines is, as the lead carrier at Reagan National, is there. And frequently what I hear from those community meetings is a perception that NextGen is all about just saving the airlines money on the fuel burn, and the perception that the FAA may be too closely aligned with the business objectives of saving money at the airlines, and those other very valid and sincere objectives of the NextGen program, as Nancy just articulated, are just not even present in the room. And of course, what is present in the room is the concern that there's been a lot of community disruption with noise. So Gary, you mentioned something that I want to come back to, which is your community being focused on the right metric, the right science for evaluating what's an acceptable level of noise for a community and what may not be. I'm putting a little few words in your mouth, but I think that was your point. And making sure that that's a focus for your elected leaders here in Washington. Now, I know that FAA is working a lot on that regard, so I'm going to ask Curtis, could you speak to some of the programs and studies that are underway at the FAA to try to address what's the appropriate way to address noise for our communities, and what the timing of some of those results may be?
Sure, I can do that. So we have an extensive research program within our office. The vast majority of the research program is dedicated to that technology development program that I referred to earlier, the CLEAN program. But we have a significant part of our research activity is geared towards better understanding the environmental impacts and establishing the basis, the scientific and technical basis that will allow us to better understand what are the noise impacts and how we should start to assess those in different ways. So we're starting to look at the level of significance that FAA currently uses to assess these NextGen procedural improvements and even airport improvements as well. Some of you may be familiar with the day-night noise level and the 65 dB significance threshold that FAA currently uses. Well, we have a study under our research program and in cooperation with our airports line of business to assess whether or not there should be a change to the 65 dB threshold of significance. Of course, there's a lot of potential policy implications of doing that, one of which has to do with land use guidelines and whether or not there would be any change in FAA's policy for sound insulation programs. That's just to name a couple. Any change that FAA contemplates with regard to that threshold level will have an impact on NextGen programs going forward, because that would set a new basis for us to assess environmental impacts under the National Environmental Policy Act. We will have to coordinate that across the federal government, because that threshold actually is used by the Department of Housing and Urban Development for veteran loans. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We've recently completed a 20 airport community survey in the United States. The analysis results of that survey are coming forward to FAA very soon. We're going to start assessing the results of that survey and starting to discuss within FAA and other federal government agencies the policy implications associated with that. And barring any unforeseen circumstances, we're hoping that by the end of this year, we'll be able to disseminate some information to the public about the survey results, which are inputs from community representatives. Over 10,000 people were surveyed at these 20 airports across the US, and we're going to distill that information, make it available to the public for review and comment, along with what we see as the policy implications, and we'll take that feedback. Again, hopefully, to answer your question, by the end of the year, we will be in a position to be able to do that. And then we have other research that's going on as well under our Center of Excellence that we've established. The Aviation Sustainability Center has roughly 16 members from academia. It's a grant-oriented program. We do a lot of scientific and technical research under that Center of Excellence, some of which has to do with assessing whether or not there's any linkage between aircraft noise and health issues, or sleep disturbance, or children's learning. So that research is also going on, but that's a little bit longer term beyond this year. And you know, it's difficult to conduct that research and draw out conclusive links to aircraft noise. And that's what we're going to need to have in order to guide us on what type of mitigation we should tailor to specific locations like Gary was talking about.
Nancy, does A4A have a viewpoint on that?
Yeah,
or?
definitely we do. So we're big supporters of the process to continue to assess the noise metric and threshold. And that's mandated by statute. So, and FAA has, taken the stewardship of that. But I note that the statute, the US aviation statutes on noise say that that should be correlated with annoyance. And so part of what's interesting, what your threshold and your metric should be correlated with annoyance. And I think that's really important for people to think about, because what they're looking at is the relationship between the point at which people are annoyed and the noise that they get. And I'm really curious to know if, among other things, Americans have become so appreciative of how well we've done in noise reduction that they're more irritable now. And so I think updating this noise annoyance curve is going to be an interesting scientific thing, but I think it's really critical what Curtis said. The policy implications are significant, and so I think it's very, very important that FAA is doing it in a stepwise way with good research. And with due respect to Gary, I do think it's good that the communities have raised the questions, but this is not an issue to be decided at the community level. It is something that needs to be decided for the national airspace, and with due respect to Congress, it's not to be decided by Congress by fiat. It really needs to be based on this scientific approach that FAA is taking.
It does occur to me, again, based on my own experience, that this research and study that's being done is incredibly important. I know in the DC area, the FAA has come forward and, in response to the community concerns, put on the table to the community possible adjustments that could be made to flight patterns that were originally put in place with the Metroplex NextGen deployment here in the DC area. And FAA is coming forward, kind of bound to using their current rules on noise procedures, or consideration of noise in establishing a procedure. And quite frankly, the current standards don't kind of matter to the community. And so the community really wants to see how adjustments in the flight procedures really are affecting noise, and they don't really embrace the standard that is in place today. So we're in a little bit of a holding pattern, if you excuse the pun. We're not making any progress in FAA's putting ideas on the table of how we could be responsive to the community concerns, but until we can introduce some of this research or measure the noise in a manner that's different than this 65-day night, which quite frankly doesn't mean anything to the community. The community knows what they hear when they're in their homes. So there's a gap here in the communication and the understanding. And I know in our particular market, we seem to be a little bit in a holding pattern with the FAA being committed to being responsive to concerns that the community's raising, but yet being a little bit hesitant to accept that legacy noise standard as the right way to be assessing noise.
Well, could I respond to that? I would just say that we're not necessarily in a holding pattern. We're already working with our air traffic organization to integrate some of our improved environmental models and tools into the procedural design process. And that would allow us to identify if there's any areas where procedures could be developed, maybe flying over water, flying over an industrial area. So that's one aspect. We are starting to integrate those tools into procedural design. And then secondly, it's a good process that you've established at DCA to bring all those communities together to talk about what are the noise issues that they're experiencing. And that roundtable forum needs to have everyone represented, because the noise isn't going to just go away. It's going to shift depending on what procedural changes you make. Of course, we're doing technology development, okay? But that takes a little more time to factor into the commercial fleet and into operations. But at any of these different locations where community groups want to ask the FAA to consider procedural changes, we need to see that the recommendations that come to the FAA have a consensus or some form of consensus. Otherwise, it's just one community saying, no, move it over to the other community. You know, instead of north departures, they should be south departures. Well, that's just shifting the noise around. So it's really a tough issue.
Gary, any perspective from your experiences?
I think as we talk about the noise, I think that noise and the associated benefits, in the conversations that go forward with the communities, there has to be a way, there should be a way of making sure that there is an understanding at every opportunity that is possible at the community level, that there are benefits, that it improves the opportunities for our local economies to grow. It creates employment opportunities for young people. It's going to create new tracks in education. If we can tell that story to our elected officials, and that becomes part of that dialogue, then they're advocating for the funding of technology improvements, they're advocating for the funding of education programs, and that creates a more holistic approach to a better and more balanced conversation as this goes forward. That has been, to me, often lacking. Within rooms such as this, there's a clear understanding of all of the benefits. At the community level, it's the person sitting under that flight path and who may not understand, or the elected officials who are only responding to that one or to that group of constituents who are under that path.
So talk a little bit about your position in your community, because I did find it unique having a background in local government and now dealing with the DCA issues in the 6 different political jurisdictions. It occurs to me that airport operators routinely interface with their local governments on zoning cases and land use decisions and building heights, as does the FAA. But the issue of noise and all the complexities that it presents and the scientific nature of all the issues is not always understood or focused on by local government jurisdictions. Your community is an exception to that. So speak a little bit about the model that you have in place, what your job is, and how it can be maybe useful for other communities.
So my job is to, if you look back at the history of the city of College Park and the city of Atlanta and the development and growth of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, there were tremendous efforts within the city of College Park to communicate, and then also within the city of Atlanta to communicate. They have a very public process for deciding all of for the funding of all of the things that will happen at Hartsfield-Jackson. Well, what was happening is that the city of College Park often didn't get the message as well as it perhaps could have from the city of Atlanta, despite their efforts in a very public setting to communicate it. So part of my job is to go to the meetings of the City of Atlanta and then to bring that information back, to create dialogue and conversation if there are concerns, that we're at the table early on so that the elected officials aren't blindsided by something that's happening and there's a perception that there was an intent to keep something from the community, because that's, in my experience, that's never been the case. So also to work to help our elected officials understand just how important the perspectives and the profitability of an airline is, and how the long period that it takes to implement change, the economics of that change, and helping them to be able to express that to their constituents. With the FAA, when policy changes or proposed policy changes come out, I assist our elected officials in the evaluation of that, and then we offer comment to the FAA. And our attempt is always to present that in a constructive, say, these are our concerns. We know that you'll evaluate these and incorporate them. So it's a position of communication. It's an intergovernmental relations position. It's also it has a technical component to it. So I have to understand in the most basic way, the implications of the technology changes that are coming, and then to help the residents of the City of College Park and the elected officials understand what the implications are. We're talking about amazing changes that are going to be coming, not just related to NextGen, but to whatever happens with UAS or VTOL or however that world evolves. And we've got to fit it in. I work with local planners. Planners often think in terms of almost a kind of a two-dimensional, this is the zoning map. Rarely do I see them thinking about there's a path coming into the airport, and that path has implications on heights of buildings. You have the noise contours, which also have to be understood and shared with the planner so that the city planning and the city zoning can hopefully over time align to the best degree possible with those noise contours.
Okay, we have maybe 1 minute left, and I just wanted to see if there was any question from the audience for any of our panel members.
I do have one question, and it's actually, and it's going to be out there just a little, and it's actually almost a precursor to the next panel. But in the principles that the president laid out for FAA reform, the issue of environmental review was something that was going to, I'm not sure I would have the right words to describe it, but it was going to be almost like an exemption or something from the air traffic organization on procedures. So I just wanted, it would be, and again, it's a good precursor because after the break, there'll be the conversation about FAA reform, but, it kind of falls into this panel's area of expertise. So anybody would like to maybe comment on the implications of that?
Nancy?
I mean, I'd like to take that because essentially, A4A is a huge supporter of taking the air traffic function out of what is now FAA and moving it into a not-for-profit. But FAA will still have a critical role in terms of integrating and making sure that the safety and the regulatory side of those procedures in aviation continue forward. In our view, the National Environmental Policy Act, every time a federal agency has to make a decision or approve anything, they have the NEPA responsibility. So in our view, the NEPA requirements will still fall on FAA, but they would be able to use that not-for-profit organization to do a lot of the work. And let me explain that. Currently, if an airport has a project and the airport is promoting the project, the airport becomes the proponent of the project, they are allowed to work through the NEPA process and with the oversight of FAA. And they're the project proponent and the rules allow for that. FAA ultimately has to make sure that the NEPA rules are followed, but they can leverage the airport, its consultants, its funding to do the NEPA work. And I think we conceive of that being the case in the future ATC model if it is brought to this not-for-profit.
Okay, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for their contributions and conversation this morning.